do is to kind of give you an overview of quite a lot. So I'm going to plug on through. So first of all, what does it mean when it says sourcing resources ethically? What does it really mean, and how do we do it? There's social procurement, buying social, responsible sourcing, ethical, sustainable procurement, green procurement, buying green, eco-buy, sustainable procurement. So that's quite a lot. But what does it really mean for us? It is a little confusing, and so today I wanted to cover some of the areas in more detail than others. And please send on questions through as I'm going, because things might be more relevant or important to you. I wanted to cover a traditional approach to procurement very quickly. I know it might be a little bit boring, however it surprises me how well versed the NFP sector is on accounting principles. But it's not very often I hear anything related to how donor dollars stretch to deliver more, or how those dollars targeted spend had ancillary benefits through deliberate and a deliberate spend approach that's aligned to and really supporting the core program outputs or our mission vision. So a little bit of Procurement 101. I promise it'll be under 2 minutes. And then we'll jump into what is sustainable procurement, really what's the difference, how does that link to the Sustainable Development Goals, what's the Sustainable Procurement ISO covers at a very high level, and how some very established procurement approaches can identify key sustainability issues like human rights, so modern slavery would be one example, environmental degradation in advance of it occurring, and hopefully some ideas to consider that you can take away. I'd really like to understand what our own supply chains look like, but I think that's more a question rather than me being able to answer that. And the sustainability core subjects, which really do look a lot like the ACFID quality principles, and what they can translate to into sustainable procurement actions. So I'm trying to take a very practical approach. So sustainability, procurement, what has that got to do with anybody in the audience? So does your organisation use auditors, law firms, research and development consultants or other professional services? Do you use or buy flights and accommodation? How about the computers in your mobile phones, promotional materials, fundraising and donation support, or even the software technology to process those donations, solar panels or other energy sources to power your organisation? So buying is one of the end outcomes of a procurement process. The decisions that feed into that are critical when spending your organisation's money and are critical to achieving sustainable sourcing or procurement outcomes. So procurement is a lot more than just buying stuff. It's actually a repeatable process. You can study it in some countries, and it's about how an organisation acquires those goods or services and how the relationship is managed ongoing. So you can see there I've translated it into TAN speak. So, ooh, I need something, which is generally your first step, so identify the need. Okay, I think I have an idea of what it is that I want, so defining the specification. Running a competitive sourcing event, which is, oh, I'm going to go and get some quotes. Evaluate and negotiation, contracting, contract and relationship management, and continuous improvement. So these are all traditional and normal procurement approaches. But one of the things in the commercial sector that is a little bit more traditional, and which I am very pleased that I'm not bound by purely, is always a focus on the lowest price. And there's challenges around that approach, and that's just the purchase price is just the tip of the iceberg. And this is one of the wonderful things about the development sector is, while price is a component, so is quality. And when you're considering sustainability concepts within a procurement process, it's not actually representative of the true costs or the total costs. There's externalities which can be monetized, so social environmental costs, and then there's use, end of life, and all of these actually consist of the entire cost or life cycle. Then there's also things like greenhouse gas emissions, so the cost of carbon, scope 1, 2 and 3 along the value chain. There's deforestation and degradation of the environment to meet market demand for products, which can often be the unintended consequences of not asking where the stuff in your stuff comes from, and is a consideration of due diligence in a procurement process, particularly a sustainable procurement process. There's community impacts, human rights violations with slave or forced labour, unfair working conditions, the use of conflict minerals in everyday electronic equipment. So do you actually know where your supplies were made? And calculating these costs would undoubtedly influence decision making at the time. There's fraud, risk, bribery, corruption. These can be through the award of contracts, ineffective governance and financial management processes, undue supply influence in industries, global supply chains and importation. If you're looking at your internal processes, PwC said in 2016, 29% of organisations worldwide have been victims of procurement fraud. So procurement is actually quite critical when it comes to effective governance, as much as it is about the outcomes and influence outside of the organisation. We're seeing increasing obligations with national and international regulations that apply to civil society as much as they do to public and commercial sectors. The supply chain reporting has come into the EU, the UK and the US, and as of last Monday, the Modern Slavery and Supply Chain Reporting Act passed the House of Representatives. It's expected to pass by the end of this year. And in June in New South Wales, modern slavery legislation was also passed. There is also e-waste legislation. There is recycling obligations. There are organisational policies and procedures, and non-compliance can bring reputational damage, as well as extensive consequences to individuals and organisations. So, all of these aspects are a part of a procurement process. And while we have just looked very much at the governance and compliance area, as you can see, procurement is much more complex than just buying stuff and buying stuff at the cheapest or the best price. And so one of the things that I often consider is, can a non-profit afford to not invest in their own procurement process and the skills in their staff who manage that? So let's get to the exciting bit. So moving beyond compliance to where innovation, both commercially as well as in public and civil society, really lies, are the interesting opportunities in sustainable procurement. Ta-da! So this is, I know it looks a bit dry again, but this is the ISO definition. So it's sustainable procurement is the process of making purchasing decisions that meet an organisation's needs for goods and services in a way that benefits not just the organisation but society as a whole, while minimising its impact on the environment, making the most positive impact across environment, social and economic pillars. Which also sounds quite broad, but there is a science and there is a way to be able to achieve that. So you can see this definition, but for me it's always been a little bit about common sense, broadening the focus of procurement or your spend from purchase price to a more holistic approach to business, and considering so much more. Sustainable procurement is incorporating considerations of potential positive and negative impacts that are relevant to your organisation. So we'll come back to the ISO in a sec. I just wanted to give you a few links to the SDGs. So sustainable procurement practices directly support the Sustainable Development Goals, all of them, and in particular SDG 12. So responsible consumption and production. So here I've provided you from the One Planet Network website a recent quote from the United Nations Secretary General, because they've highlighted that there's significant gaps regarding SDG 12. It's fragmented, it's piecemeal, and the scale and pace across all actors of society needs to be embraced and dramatically stepped up if we are to achieve the 2030 agenda. And though it is a standalone goal, it should be seen as an enabler because it actually has the potential to touch and enable every other SDG. What is SDG 12? So SDG 12 is sustainable tourism, because everybody travels and we should be considering the impacts of when we make those choices. It's consumer information for sustainable consumption and production, so allowing consumers to make informed choices and drive positive behavioural change. It's sustainable buildings and construction, so embedding good practices and sustainability criteria in a high risk and critical societal pillar. There's also sustainable food systems, which is actually quite a big one, really interesting, which is focused on sustainable food consumption and production patterns. We also have sustainable lifestyles and education, which is trying to create a new norm in lifestyle choices through the adoption of resource efficiency, biodiversity, climate change, poverty eradication, social well-being, which I just think is really powerful. And then we have sustainable public procurement. So trying to use the estimated euros 5.8 trillion, which in Australian dollars is $9.3 trillion spent on public procurement, and that's just the OECD alone, as a powerful force for positive change. So yes, we have our own SDG. 12.7, promote public procurement practices that are sustainable in accordance with national policies and priorities, measured by the number of countries implementing sustainable public procurement policies and action plans, which is pretty powerful. If you take out the word public, then this can be applied to all of us, because that's the power of procurement. So this brings me to the ISO. Why was there a sustainable procurement ISO developed? In 2013, the social responsibility ISO was published, and business provided the feedback that it wasn't able to achieve practically elements of the social responsibility ISO, not so much the principles, but how did they actually embed that in their own businesses. So sustainable procurement was considered a critical priority and the next ISO off the rank. Why? Because what's the most ideal place to maximise positive impacts in a modern global consumer society where they're spending money? So what was missing? The practical guidance on how to do it. And that can be applied irrespective of country, size, sector of the organisation. So there are 52 countries, some of you may have seen this, 52 countries were involved in developing the ISO. It was developed over 4 years, and it represents powerfully 65% of the world's population, 85% of global GDP, and 73% of the total CO2 emissions. I was privileged to represent ACFID both nationally and internationally as a part of the Australian Committee. And in the notes there's all of the countries that were involved, and there was representatives across every continent, which was really impressive. There was official liaisons with the intergovernmental agencies and key ISO standards, and Sustainable Procurement ISO now forms a part of the baseline guidance and measurement indicators across UN agencies' programs in this space. So if you see Sustainable Public Procurement or SPP mentioned, then the ISO is one of those documents that can be used to measure against. So what makes the ISO so special? So I thought I would whiz through the structure. If any of you are interested in really doing a deep dive in some of the principles in here, please let me know. But as you can see from this slide, there are 4 sections. So each section is designed to provide practical guidance on how to include sustainability aspects across an organisation, and there's more detail in the notes, so what the fundamental section provides, policy and strategy, the enablers, and then the procurement process section. I was very proud to lead the working group for almost 2 years on the procurement process. I'm a very passionate procurement professional, as well as, I think that was covered in the blurb, thanks for that, ACFID ladies. So this is where I think it gets really interesting. The principles which are in the ISO. So I've actually copied here because the Fred Hollows Foundation, we published our first global procurement policy earlier in the year, and this is a direct excerpt which you can see in the notes, which is modifying the ISO principles for our procurement principles. And I think this provides a wonderful opportunity for lateral thinking and creating greater shared value in a commercial context, so how we're using our money. It's perfectly aligned to civil society's purpose and can be applied to the back office, which is often considered the least exciting area of an organisation. I will declare my complete bias. I find the potential to deliver benefits and opportunities with a real long-term positive impact through sustainable procurement, particularly in an international development context. Really exciting, and it's fascinating and it's inspiring. So how do you apply accountability? How do you apply transparency, full and fair opportunity? I think these are all really powerful principles, and it's something that for long-term projects I'd really like to see us being able to measure the impacts of the procurement process. One of the things that I do like the most is that it's actually articulating innovative solutions. And also continual improvement. So how do we learn from what we experience? How do we share that knowledge? Which are all wonderful ethos within the development sector as well. So I really think that the principles of the Sustainable Procurement ISO align with what it is that our core purpose is. So how does that actually have the sustainability context overlaid? So the global accepted sustainability issues are the 7 core subjects, and they were published in the Social Responsibility ISO, and they are also reflected in the ACFID quality principles. So organisational governance, so including sustainability consideration in the decision-making processes and structures. Human rights, so due diligence, where we actually look at the entire supply chain, not just the initial contracting party or tier 1. But there's also discrimination, grievance mechanisms, cultural rights, rights at work, labour practices, so employment relationships, conditions of work, fair competition, social dialogue, the environment, which I think that most of the audience should be relatively well versed on, and how can you actually apply prevention and risk mitigation plus positive outcomes in a procurement process. Fair operating practices, so the anti-corruption, responsible political involvement, fair competition, respect for property rights. Consumer issues. Now this one's really interesting, and it actually, I think that to be able to deliver on this is quite powerful, and it's something that perhaps maybe more in the private sector, but consumer issues contains fair marketing, factual and unbiased information, fair contractual practices, protecting consumers' health and safety, sustainable consumption, service and support, which also includes intellectual property, complaint and dispute resolution, data protection and privacy, education and awareness, and then the last one, community involvement and development. So again, I think that this sector is relatively well versed on this particular principle or subject. but community involvement and how can technology development and access help within a procurement context or a procurement process, social investment and health. So these are the core subjects. And I hear you say, okay, you're already across the sustainability concepts, but what does that really mean in a procurement context? And how would you start on your journey if you're sitting in your organisation and wanting to develop and deliver a sustainable procurement function? So you can't do everything and you can't be everyone. So procurement is much like each of our organisations, our projects, our geographic locations, our partners and our core focus, all a bit different according to who, what, where and why. So using a traditional procurement method of spend and supply segmentation, with a sustainability lens applied, you can prioritise where to apply the effort and focus specific to your supply chain risks and opportunities that suits your organisation. So the first question is, what is relevant? So what, do you have a gender focus or a First Nation people focus? Are you working in remote or local communities? Are you an environmental or animal rights focused organisation? So what is your core mission? We have a natural alignment with sustainability themes, and those themes should be embedded in our spend and procurement process. It's an excellent place to start. Then the second criteria is criticality. So you always start with the most important things. And while it might not be ideal, if the lever is for internal engagement is purely compliance against codes of conduct or legislation, then it's not a bad place to start because it is a start. So if you're not compliant, you don't really have a license to operate. But beyond compliance, what do you spend the most money on? Is it the auditors and law firms, research and development consultants or other professional services? Is it your travel or vehicles, your IT computers and mobile phones, fundraising, marketing, software, solar panels, renewable energy, all of the things that I mentioned before? So whatever you're spending the most money on, so highest dollars with the highest relevance, or even medium dollars with the highest relevance, that determines the criticality to your organisation. Then there's the risk. So what would shut you down if you didn't do it? So what would your donors turn around and say, well, if you're not delivering on, then you're effectively not providing what the core mission is. The risk is also a factor and is included in criticality. So then control, which is not normally a word that we would use. So control could be interpreted as manage. So what can you directly manage to achieve the desired outcome? Is your organisation well respected in the area and has a lot of leverage because of that, or has a lot of spend, a celebrity name attached to it, knows all the players in the market? And therefore the other organisations or your suppliers are willing to deliver on those requirements? Or is it an area you're able to influence? So manage/control and influence are two different subjects. However, they're both really important to understand your priorities. So if you have the ability to influence, but you can't do it on your own, perhaps that's an opportunity with a consortium or a collective of similar-minded organisations to positively influence behaviour or outcomes along your supply chain. Or is it an opportunity for you to use your own benchmarks and case studies and learnings to provide value to your partners, and also to demonstrate to your suppliers how you can influence positively change? And then the fourth criteria is the amount of effort to deliver the outcome. So this is again very traditional procurement, just with a slightly different lens. So you generally start with the things that are the low to moderate effort with the high impact, because then you can demonstrate the benefits and the wins, and you can then have the time to plan the higher effort initiatives. What are the strategic and core organisational focus areas? And if those values and initiatives are not included in your spend targets, then aligning with your strategy means that it should be easier to get internal buy-in. And so an easy example, one that I particularly like, which Fred Hollows New Zealand have delivered on, is partnering with a renewable energy power solution and some engineers to deliver in their hospital construction self-generating renewable energy, which reduces the impact of unreliable power and the associated reduction in medical interventions. And I think that that was very clever and very aligned with what the core purpose of the organisation is. Okay, so this is a very busy slide because how do you actually apply all that theory in a way that's going to be meaningful? So here I have provided an example. Yes, just to answer, my apologies. Oh, and there are 3 considerations but only 2 axes. There's actually 4, but I'm not really good when it comes to 4-dimensional diagrams, so apologies. I can send you something after this webinar, if you like, Owen, which gives you a little bit more detail around that diagram. Excellent catch, a little bit more detail around that diagram. Excellent catch though. So here I have included the Japanese ISO committee's example around sustainability issues. Obviously in Japan, electronic equipment manufacturing is really important to their economy, and so they use this example to provide insights on how you actually do the effectively mapping exercise according to the priorities. So I might not necessarily have mapped it exactly the same way in which they have, but this gives you a really good idea. So if you're an electronic manufacturer, as you can see, the impacts to the environment across your entire value chain are critical. And then they have prioritised human rights and labour practices. And so you can see, if you're working with the suppliers that are providing the goods and services across the life cycle, so that top axis, the life cycle axis, for electronic manufacturing, you've got raw materials, production and processing of those. Then you've got maintenance and the manufacturing process of the refined product. You've got the packaging, transport and storage, logistics, through to the retail stores. You've got consumers' usage, and then you've got disposal or end-of-life recycling considerations. So that's the top, that's the actual process for electronics. Then down the left axis, you've got the sustainability subjects. So human rights, labour practices, environment, fair operating practices, consumer issues, community involvement and development. Again, I will say that I might not necessarily have mapped it the same way, but I didn't want to mess with somebody else's mapping exercise for the purposes of giving you an idea on how you do this. So yeah, there is definitely conflict mineral challenges in raw material extraction, particularly for electronics. There's forced labour, modern slavery. We know that there's safety, health and working conditions. We can see that across the environment there's use of water, CO2 emissions, downstream and upstream, so scope 1, 2 and 3 would be components and considerations. This gives you an idea of what they have then mapped, and then how that then would mean that the negotiation for the suppliers that are providing the goods or services along each of those areas how you would start to address through due diligence, through your competitive process, and then contracts. So identifying your material sustainability issues allows you to improve your supply chain and partner with the suppliers to provide quantifiable outcomes. And please stop me because I recognise that that's quite I can actually provide you a template as well if you'd like something along those lines that you can use to map your own internal supply chain risks and priorities as well as the opportunities. But this is what the output of doing the mapping exercise would look like. So after you have understood your organisation's priorities, you've assessed the material risk and the opportunities, and I really think it's important to look at things where if a supplier isn't actually at the standard or level that you would hope for, then that doesn't necessarily mean cutting ties and walking away. If they're willing to work with you to be able to address that, then you're using your positive influence to achieve a better outcome. Understanding what the risks can provide some wonderful opportunities for improvement. And if you have an impact statement where you understand if no action is taken what the outcome could be or potential for the organisation, then you're ready to integrate that into the procurement process. So the need for sustainable options in the procurement process is now clear. The sustainability criteria is well defined. The suppliers can be sourced against these requirements. Evaluation against the sustainability core subjects and specific criteria is simplified. The contract negotiation includes objectives for both parties, and with ongoing performance and monitoring, a collaborative partnership outcome. And that is the most simplistic way to be able to demonstrate how you would integrate sustainability considerations into a procurement process. Now, of course, if only everything was that simple, but that gives you a really good idea of the theory around it. And we all do work in very challenging environments, so being able to either expand on some of these steps or expand on some of these considerations and apply those internally is a part of the challenge, as well as I find it a very interesting and wonderful opportunity. Every day is a little bit different, and the ability to influence positive change is remarkable. So, it's in all of our hands to be able to achieve these outcomes. One of the things that I must admit, I often attend commercial sector procurement discussions, but I've never actually been to a development procurement discussion. So I'm not sure if there's a lot of discussion outside of individual organisations, and I would really encourage talking to each other. I know every time I talk to a different agency, I get another idea on how we could apply that, or even what I might want to avoid. Often talking about the challenges is really helpful because that helps us streamline our processes and our approach. We can talk to friends and other ACFID members. That's the wonderful opportunity that ACFID's providing us. Perhaps we could look at setting up a community of practice around procurement. So please, I think that we should be talking more. I think we should be sharing information. If you don't already have a commitment to implement environmental and social sustainability principles in your purchasing or procurement process, you can set a policy and you can set a standard. And that's always the first step. So inform your choices. Do we actually know who you are buying from? Do you know what it is that you're buying and each of the pieces that make up your components? What it is that you require with that type of product. I know that we are less inclined to look at single-use products, but surprising how much can slip through the cracks. If you have a procurement team, I'd be really interested to know. So if you do have one and you're a part of the decision making, have a chat to them, ask them about these questions, and if possible, include them in program or concept planning and design. If you don't have a procurement function, then talk to the people that are the budget owners and ask them if they can answer those questions. Is there sustainability certification that's set as a minimum standard for even fundamental or basic things like paper? Think strategically. Is that new vehicle really needed? There's lots of opportunity around what you're actually doing internally. Often it takes taking a breath and that planning and communication across silos to be able to achieve that outcome. Use your influence. Whether that's the organisation or you as an individual and a budget owner or a decision maker. You have the ear of suppliers and manufacturers. Can that deliver an interesting, innovative opportunity for collaboration? How can we partner more effectively together? And how can you strive to get better outcomes each time? We require positive change externally. I don't often see how we're delivering those things internally, and I know that I really enjoyed the previous spotlight because that gave me some ideas and insights. Perhaps that's something that we could do more, is have those conversations. I firmly believe that we are stronger together. Now this one, I absolutely love the fact when, and I will admit that this was a little bit of a surprise to me. So did you know collectively ACFA members spent $1.6 billion? So even if you take out the administrative 15–20%, we're still looking at a considerable sum of money. In Pakistan and Cambodia, it's very expensive or hard to get certified sustainably sourced paper in both of those countries. In Africa, new vehicles don't have the same emission standards as they do in Europe, Australia or Nepal. In Bangladesh, there is now a much larger women-owned cleaning business that sorts the type of waste and distributes that waste to the appropriate waste facility for the end-of-life treatment. In Australia, door-to-door fundraising companies provide the same services to almost all of the charities. Looking at this dollar figure, imagine what we could actually do together. If you go to the One Planet Network website, Australia is lagging with case studies and examples of SDG actions. And while we might partner with many other countries or other external organisations, how can we as a sector drive greater adoption internally and externally? So I have a few ideas, but these are the things that I would really like everyone to have as some takeaways that are really easy to deliver. Asking questions, attending commercial procurement conferences. One of the things that I think you'll be surprised is if you are working in a procurement function in our sector, sharing our stories is quite inspirational for other procurement teams, because they rarely get to see the outcome of what it is that they work so hard to achieve, and they don't get to see it in quite the same way that we do, which is very powerful. Share information, inform ourselves, talk to each other. Targeted spend can really provide economic empowerment. So if we're looking at the individual 7 core subjects, so governance, we can lead by example by applying the principles of sustainable procurement and sharing that knowledge and frameworks and collaborating. Or we could consider, adopt and share life cycle costings and circular economy approaches. I do have some links at the end of the slide deck with some kind of intergovernmental resources that are excellent to be able to grab. But there is just so much in procurement that we could pull apart. So if there's interest, I think it would be wonderful for us to continue doing deep dives on some of these either procurement practices or sustainability subjects. So human rights, if you're over 100 million per annum, this is going to be quite challenging given the amount of teams and resources and skill sets that we have, but it's on us to be able to lead by example. So the due diligence assessment process that can identify adverse human rights in our supply chain, and through wonderful other NGOs like the Walk Free Foundation and I believe some of our other bigger members have documented high-risk categories in locations and due diligence questionnaires that perhaps the smaller agencies can borrow or leverage to be able to assess their own supply chains. Labour practices. We can ensure the staff of our suppliers and supply chain, as well as our own staff, have effective governance and occupational health and safety systems and processes to prevent harm to them through their working conditions. We can be transparent with any internal gender equity pay gaps. They're just a couple off the top of the head. When it comes to the environment, we could consider embedding carbon footprint, not just carbon emissions associated with goods or services into our procurement selection process. We can partner with other agencies who specialise in those energy, water conservation areas, or even assess and share the efficient use of materials, including end-of-life practices. We could have those agencies come in and present to our internal staff to kickstart off other ideas on how your organisation could adopt those. We could ask for evidence of international standards or certification around environmental management systems as a part of your supplier evaluation. We can promote positive principles in the areas of influence. There's quite a, the environment, there's just so much potential. So fair operating practices, invest and advocate in your staff and supply chain partners and other organisations. Effective procurement, as much as effective financial and legal internal processes. And conduct education programs with external organisations, whether they're suppliers or partners, on how to prevent corruption, fraud, collusion and bias. How would you identify that and have a whistleblowing mechanism in which to be able to address that? What about considering how small medium enterprise can participate in your organisational spend if you haven't already done that? And how your feedback and time, if they're unsuccessful, can actually build capacity and improve their business. Consumer issues, so we could provide in collaboration with our suppliers information about sustainability issues and impacts across the supply chain. We could make use of reliable and effective labelling schemes, and we can promote other positive environmental consumer issues. And then the last one, community involvement and development. So we can consider in consultation with suppliers the economic and social impacts of entering or leaving a community. We can put those metrics and build those into our program design, and we can measure the outcomes of those as the project continues through its term. We can include impacts and basic resources needed for the sustainable development of the communities that we're working in as ancillary to what our core purpose is. If we're not already doing it, let's consider local suppliers for goods or services and have that defined and clearly articulated, and as a part of that, highlight to the suppliers the importance of perhaps not the local standards when it comes to the responsibilities for regulation or better practice, or even helpful innovations that can increase the business of that supplier as a result of working with us. One of the key things that I think that we should really embed is that there's not really a need to recreate the wheel when it comes to these concepts. There's lots of existing methodologies that can be applied. What we have is the values and the ethos to be able to achieve those. And I think that that makes it really powerful for our sector. So I've only got one more slide left because I'm a little bit conscious of time, and I apologise for going over. Like I said, I seriously could talk about this for a really long time. And this is just the theory. This isn't actually how, like, case studies and what we can really do about it. But I've included some links for further information. Sharing information and practical guidance is really useful for being able to deliver on those outcomes. And lastly, one of Fred's statements that I really quite like, and is a part of the reason why I work here, is because I genuinely believe that we're here to look out for each other, and I think more so in the development sector, sharing information, helping each other achieve those objectives is a really wonderful outcome. I also want to be the change that I want to deliver, so if you need any additional information around sustainable procurement, it would always be a pleasure, though I will confess I am a little strapped for time. But if you're in Sydney, please don't hesitate to let me know. It would be a pleasure to share, or if not, drop me an email anytime.
Brilliant, thanks Tanya. We might pause now and ask if there's any questions. I also, towards the end of the webinar, will have some updates from the learning team as well. We have a question from Craig about whether Fred Hollows would be willing to share their procurement policy.
100%. I actually need to amend it to make it shareable for my Kenyan team is doing a 20 category pre-qualification process at the moment, so I'm going to strip out the internal pieces and have that ready to go for the pre-qual. I think it's due by the end of next week, so if you want to drop me an email when I've done that, I'd be happy to share that with you. And I also look forward to having that on our external website too at some point in the near future.
Fabulous. And do we have any other questions from Tanya before we start wrapping up? I'll just let everyone know that we will send out copies of the slides, so all those wonderful graphics and the information that Tanya's included we'll share with everyone before the end of the week.
There's some great ideas there, Owen.
Yeah. That is a great idea. I personally can't speak to what kind of potential is out there, but we have included in the survey at the end of this webinar, if there's enough interest out there to put together a community of practice around procurement and sustainable procurement. And from there, anything's possible. Like, once we all start talking and getting together and seeing what opportunities we can leverage.
Oh, that I should mention, I do have subject matter experts that would be happy at any point to come in and do deep dive sessions. So Heather from the Salvation Army, if we wanted to talk about modern slavery. I have the Good Environmental Choice Australia to talk about sustainable labels. So if there's anything of particular interest, with a little bit of time we can have some excellent subject matter experts come and present on that particular theme. So I hope we continue the conversation.
Yes. Craig, thanks for that note about Mark. I'll follow up with him and we'll try and include an update in our email out to everyone on that front. Okay, so we might start wrapping up the webinar now. Tanya, thank you so much for a fantastic webinar.
My pleasure, and I was very well behaved. I didn't make any of my usual jokes.
Maybe for the next time.
And yeah, thanks to everybody for attending. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. So thank you so much, Tanya. Before we wrap up, we do have some updates from the learning team. The first is a call for experts. If you are an expert in any of the areas listed on this slide, Australian Industry Skills really wants to hear from you. They've put out a call for subject matter experts to be part of the project that identifies and defines supply chain skills. So if you're interested in being a subject matter expert in this project, you can check out the project webpage, and we'll also include the details about this project in our follow-up email. Our second update is about some learning events that are coming up. They're all open for registrations. We've got another webinar on Thursday. INTL FC Stone will be presenting on making use of global payment technologies, so registration is open for that one. And in October, we also have a webinar launching ACFID's new gender audit toolkit and a webinar on developing a prevention of financial wrongdoing policy. Those events are also open for registration. And if you're in Melbourne, there's also some workshops. We have the launch of research and messaging to reduce unrequested goods sent overseas during humanitarian crises. And for any new starters in your organisation, we also have the Introduction to the Aid and Development Sector workshop in November. Finally, and I teased this earlier on, Spotlight on Quality Principle 8 will be rolling out over the next month. We've got some great things lined up. This webinar was just the beginning. We've also got blogs, a video from one of our members, new resources, all kinds of things that will be rolling out. So keep an eye on the ACFID blog and on our social media to keep up to date. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. So we'll just ask that you stay on board to complete a very short survey. It does include a question on which principles of sustainable procurement you would like to learn more about, and also a question about how much interest is out there for a potential procurement community of practice. So thanks again, everyone, for attending the webinar. Thank you, Tanya, and we hope to see you all at future learning events. In the meantime, have a really lovely afternoon.